Hello everybody and welcome to the Animorphs Universe channel. We're doing another AniLysis today, and it is on the Andalite fighter spacecraft. These funny looking things. Now, what I thought there'd be more to these things, but actually they're not seen too often throughout the series. I thought we'd be talking about things like the Jahar or the Askelin, but actually they're different ships altogether. The fighter ships are much smaller units, basically the Andalite equivalent of the bug fighters, where you have a very limited number of crew, probably 2 at most, and they just do the blam blam blammo. So they are very important at the very start of the Yerk War, because they are right there at the start of the Yerk War. These 400 Geds overwhelmed my warriors, Alaran said, building back to anger again. And then they seized the 4 attack fighters and 2 transports that were on the ground at the time. There were 4 Andalite fighter craft and 2 transport ships, and those were the first things that the Yerks took when they finally turned traitor on the was it traitor? Not really. They turned against the Andalites. So 4 of these things and 2 larger ships that were transport that were used to take more Yerks out into space in order to carry out invasions on the Nahara and the Hork-Bajir and what have you. So it was one of the very first bits that gave the Yerks technology. And we know that the Yerks basically stole a lot of Andalite technology, and probably a lot of it came immediately from these ships. So actually, in the grand scheme of things, they were very important in the Yerk War. What was the actual purpose of these fighter craft? Axe reached the bridge first. He leaned his torso forward and looked over Quaffajinavon's shoulder. "One of ours," Axe said. Then he clarified. "An Andalite fighter. It must be on a deep patrol, harassing the Yerk defences. Launch 2 fighters. They are to go in with sensors on full active, no stealth measures. If whoever is hiding behind that moon is peaceful, we do not want to sneak up on them. And if they are not so peaceful, well, let them think they are facing nothing but a pair of careless fighters." The name implies first off that they are fighters, so if they're engaged in a battle, then they will do that. And we will see that in quotes later on. But also from those quotes we can see that they're general patrol units, but they also have the capability of scouting, sensing other craft, looking at other craft, basically peeking their noses in things. So not too much in terms of uses and versatility, but the small jobs it seems to be capable of doing. So you'd imagine if there was an Andalite outpost somewhere, you'd have 2 or 3 of the things just sort of swirling around, just keeping an eye on everything, basically as sentries. And they were able to, you know, if something were to come along, they'd be able to quickly sense what they are and report back. As well as general pew fighting duties. So we've covered the historical relevance, according to the Yerk War. We've looked at the general purposes. Let's now look at the physical attributes of this thing, okay? So Ghost of Essan did this picture for me after I sent these descriptions. First of all, it wasn't all that big. It was about as long as a school bus. The front end was a pod, shaped almost like an egg. Extending from the back of the pod was a long, narrow shaft. There were 2 crooked, stubby, wing-like things, and on the end of each wing was a long tube that glowed bright blue on the back end. The little spaceship looked almost cute, you know, kind of harmless, except that it had a sort of tail, a mean-looking tail that curved up and forward, coming to a point that looked as sharp as a needle. On the end was a wickedly curved, very sharp-looking horn or stinger. It reminded me of the alien's spaceship. It had seemed kind of cute and harmless, until you noticed the tail. Our fighters were elongated ovals with 2 long, cylindrical engines attached by stubby wings on either side. Our main weapon, or shredder, arched overhead much like an Andalite tail. We flew the pool ship to a rendezvous point, just beyond the moon's orbit. Then, in a rush, perhaps 2 dozen of the slightly goofy-looking Andalite fighters came swooping around us. They surrounded us, shredder weapons aimed. It was a hair-raising moment. So these things generally have a goofy, cutesy sort of appearance, so very rounded in shape, which the Andalites are known for. Everything's sort of rounded, you don't get many sharp edges. So we've got an egg-like shape at the front here, with a shaft coming out the back. It's got the shredder weapon arched over the front, coming to a pointed end. And then you probably can't see it that well there, but there's two, well, we're looking at the side, so we can only see one. One almost teardrop shaped thing, wing coming out of this. So you've got a big bulky unit there, and then it comes out there, and then you've got, it looks like blue engine flare coming out. Why is that swinging around? You've got blue engine flare coming out from the shaft of this engine on the side. So I think that's a pretty good representation of how it looks. Again, long as a school bus. You've got the visor at the front here, and that does become apparent later on when we talk about the interior of the ship. But I think that's a pretty fair representation. Flying over, I'm not sure if that's Earth or not. It's blue, so I'm going to say that's Earth. Let's now look at the interior. So let's step into the side of the ship. A thin arc of light appeared, a doorway, opening slowly in the smooth side of the pod part of the ship. The opening grew, like a crescent moon at first, then a full, bright circle. So in the pod part of the ship, so this round bit at the front, there is a perfectly circular door, which I believe is this circle here. That seems to be a fair assumption. There it is. So that opens up, and then we walk in to what is assumedly this bridge bit here. I walked over to the door of the ship and looked inside. It was surprisingly simple. It looked cozy, almost. Everything was a creamy colour, with rounded edges and shapes that tended to be oval. I stepped up into the ship. There was no chair, just a sort of open space where I guess the Andalite stood on his 4 hooves while he worked the few controls. There weren't a lot of buttons or anything. I wondered if the Andalite controlled the ship with his thoughts. I quickly reached for the box and started to head back outside. But then something caught my eye. It was a small, 3-dimensional picture. 4 Andalites, standing all together, looking like a really strange gathering of deer with solemn faces. 2 of them looked like very small kids. I realised that this was a picture of the Andalite's family. The inside of a fighter is not exactly roomy. This was an older model, built for 2, but it was still not exactly big. Figures they'd give us an old piece of junk Model 14 to fly, I said, staring at the controls as if I'd never seen them before. What did you expect them to give us? A brand new Model 22? That's as far as we get of descriptions of the inside of the Andalite fighter craft. Not much room, no seating, because obviously Andalites don't have conventional seats like we do. And there aren't many controls, leading Jake to think that he uses his mind, Elfangor uses his mind to control his vessel. And everything's cream coloured and oval shaped. We've already discussed how everything's basically oval shaped for the Andalites. But apart from that, and quite disappointingly, we didn't get much of a description. You know, first book of the series, our first interaction with alien tech, you'd think that Jake would give a bit more of a description of the inside of this vessel. He doesn't even say where he picks up the blue box from, so that blue box is inside Elfangor's vessel, and there's no description of it being like in a little cubby somewhere or just on a podium in the middle. No, he just picks it up from nowhere apparently and takes it back outside. So it is a shame that we don't get much of a description, apart from lack of controls, small space, no chair, and everything's creamy and oval. That's basically all there is. Then again, it's a small fighter, so there probably really isn't that much in there. A control panel in front of the visor or the screen, the hatch, and then probably a back compartment into the engine bay or something like that. Probably really not much to it. So now we've looked at the appearance both inside and outside, let's look at the more functional side of this thing. Firstly, probably the most noticeable is the overarching, literally overarching shredder weapon. At the same time, a blinding beam of blue light shot from the tail of the Andalite ship. It sliced into the nearest bug fighter. The fighter fired a full-power shredder blast at the asteroid. The green beam zapped through the vacuum. A flash of green streaked by. "Shredder fire!" Aldrea yelled, and suddenly I was up and running toward the front of the ship. Then the parked fighter began to turn again. The swooping shredder mounts came to bear on us. I waited, wondering who was holding the trigger of those powerful weapons. We have two contradictions here, in the space of 4 quotes, but we can sort of gather which ones are more accurate based on, more descriptions in the series. These are just 4 that spring to mind, and there are other little clues here and there throughout the series that sway it one way or the other. Firstly, the colour of the shredder beam fire. In the Invasion, it's described as blue. But every other time throughout the series, and in those quotes there, it's described as a green beam. Which is why I believe Ghost of SM has done a green tip to this shredder weapon up here. So yeah, in the Invasion it's blue, but in every case after that, the shredder fire from the Andalite fighters is green. So I'm guessing it's just a retcon from book 1. I get the feeling that they thought everything about these Andalites is just a bit too blue. I think they need a bit more colour variation on their metaphorical palette. And then the amount of weapons. So every time they're mentioned on the Andalite fighters, it's mentioned that there's this swooping tail overhead, and at the end of this tail is the actual weapon at the top. But this one time in the Hork-Bajir Chronicles, it's mentioned that there are mounts, plural, turning weapons, as if they were 2. Like that. But that's the only time they ever come across that. And we have to bear in mind as well that that Andalite fighter, though it's still technically an Andalite fighter, has been in Yeerk control for quite some time. They've been developing their own weapons, so perhaps why there are now plural. Because I believe on the actual bug fighters, they had dual weapons, rather than the Andalite's 1 over the top. So that could explain that inconsistency. It probably should have been mentioned if it was meant to be a deliberate inconsistency, but either way we can speculate. And I'm going to speculate that it's because the Yeerks changed the design to dual weaponry rather than single. Okay, that's that dealt with. But what if the Andalite fighter came under attack? It's going to be in battle situation, so of course it's going to be under attack. It has defensive shields. Some of the other bug fighters were already firing, the fools. But at this range, the Andalite defensive shields were too strong. The Andalite ships flared, shrugging off the energy. A single massively powerful Dracon beam lanced from the ground and hit the pursuing Andalite. In the view screen, I saw the right side of his ship explode. The Andalite pilot was still alive, still fighting to get some control when his wrecked fighter hit a 1,000-foot tall tree. These 2 quotes came from the same scene. So, a Yeerk fighter is shooting from quite a long range at the Andalite fighters, but it's causing very little damage because of the defensive shields. But a Dracon ground attack from a large weapon at closer range is able to defeat these defensive shields. So they do have shields, defensive shields, but they're not that powerful. At long range, they can stop Dracon fire, or presumably Shredder fire or any other laser type fire. But it becomes weaker at close range, probably because these are only small units. And remember what the last AniLysis was? We're talking about Andalite force fields. The smaller the generator, the less power it's going to give. And actually, we know that these defensive shields are effectively force fields. How do we know that? Because Gefinland and Myrtle took a force field generator from their crashed fighters. Myrtle and I were fortunate to have salvaged many things after the crash, Gefinland explained. Most important, a good power supply and a force field generator. The latter is particularly necessary for our survival. So these defensive shields are presumably powered by these force field generators within the small craft, but it doesn't have much power because it's not going to take up much space, so it's going to be a very small one. So that is why a ground-based Dracon platform will probably be able to take these out of the sky quite effectively, whereas long-range blasts from a Yeerk fighter is not going to do as much damage. And that links quite nicely to the previous AniLysis, so excellent. Wife's playing a game in the other room. Go check out my Ahiba Games channel and you'll see what happens with that, I'm sure. Let's now move on, pun intended, to the movement of these craft. How do they get around? what do they get around on? Because these small Andalite fighters aren't setting off one by one from the docks, they're being transported. Captain Neriford turned his face and his main eyes towards my brother, while his stalk eyes kept watch on the monitors. The humour was gone from his face. Prince Elfangor, it is time. Launch all fighters. These Andalite fighters oftentimes are aboard the larger dome ships, these vast Andalite city ships, effectively. And there's a docking area for these little Andalite fighters, and they're all stationed in there. Picture something out of like the Death Star in Star Wars. They've got that middle bit where they all land and there's ships all around there. It's like that. But the dome ships aren't the only ones that contain Andalite fighter units, because the Intrepid in Book 54, Axe's ship, once he becomes Prince, sent off Andalite fighters, and Axe describes what type of ship the Intrepid is. It made my cruiser class Intrepid look like a toy. We can probably assume that any larger class of ship, be it the cruiser class of the Intrepid or the I forget a dome ship's name, but the dome ships carry these fighters. And what happens when, S hits the fan and the Yerk bug fighters are coming through? Well, a big alarm goes through the ship's comms and the fighters get into position. Elfangor and I came to a pair of drop shafts. Warriors were zooming down, heading for the fighter bays. The warriors, the pilots, go down to the fighter bays, they jump in their craft, and then this is the process by which they leave the ship and then zoom off to wherever they need to go. Automatic launch sequence begins in 10 seconds, the prince called. Simultaneous drop. Go to burn on my mark. Acceleration standard. Intercept team, go to burn, the prince said with total calm. 2 of the lighters lit up their engines. With a brilliant blue glow, the 2 fighters flashed out of sight into the black of space. The Yerk was busy powering up the shredders, and then busy using the fighters' manoeuvring thrusters to turn it toward the battle, bringing the shredders to bear. Chase team, go to burn, the prince said. I punched the control pad and it was like we'd been kicked in the back. Shwoof! We were out of there. Out of there. Unfortunately, we had taken off so fast we'd shot right past the prince's own fighter. Ah! Oh no! No! I ordered the computer to match velocity with the other fighters. So there we have a sequence of quotes that pretty much describe the process of them initially moving off. So they're launched automatically, which you'd think would actually cause some problems really, but the fighters are there, ready in their ships, and the prince calls in and says, right, you're automatically launching in 3, 2, 1, off you go. And the ship just boots them out. What happens in the case of, we've got 10 seconds to lift off, but actually we've got a problem with the hatch. Hatch isn't closing, sir. Hatch isn't closing, sir. I know it's 3 seconds. Hatch isn't closing. And dead. What happens in that situation? I suppose they call up and they just immediately halt it. But then what? Do they do a manual on that one? It's never explained. But that is the default process. They are launched automatically and the ship just basically boots them out into space. And then the prince also insists on telling them when to go to burn, which seems to imply that's when you accelerate. There's also, he says, acceleration standard, so they probably set an acceleration speed and wait for the order to come through and they press the button and the ship will accelerate at that speed. That seems to be the given there. But when Elfangor did it, he clearly went to maximum burn, so he set the thing all the way, and so when he pressed the thing, the ship went far too fast and he had to bring it back. Basically, he's just completely inexperienced, which is fine, we've all been there. But that seems to be how it works. So the prince on the ship has a large say in how these things move, at least during the first phase. I personally think it's probably a bit too restrictive to launch them all at the same time and demand for them to go to burn. Surely the pilot is in a better position to know when to go to burn. But then again, that's it. We're talking about an alien race. They probably have different operating procedures. And it might even be the wisest one. I don't know. They have manoeuvring thrusters. You might notice I wedged that little quote in there because I thought it was just interesting. Because this is an Andalite fighter and has manoeuvring thrusters. And that sort of implies that it's got thrusters on the thing which are designed specifically to turn or force turn in the same way that a bird's feathers, that you'll have some feathers that are there specifically to control like the turning. So that is the process of how it goes out, it goes to burn, and it does all it moves using its maneuvering thrusters. Okay, how fast can these things go? Computer, maximum burn. Whoosh. My engines lit up and I was blown back across the fighter's cramped bridge. Go to zero space, I yelled. Whatever these things are, they can't have zero space flight. I guess the fighter pilot thought the same thing. I saw his engines glow bright as he powered up for a zero space jump. So I was a bit wrong earlier. I got my quotes mixed up where I said that Elfhanger went to maximum burn and then had to slow down. It probably wasn't maximum burn, but it was probably higher than everyone else had set theirs. So, but maximum burn is weird, and we will discuss this in a different analysis. But maximum burn, I think it's supposed to like warp time, which makes it a really silly option to have in your vessel, especially in just a little fighter. But we know that it has this maximum burn thing, and once they activate it, they're blown back into the back of the cockpit. And this happens a couple of times where they get blown back. And you think the Andalites would be clever enough to invent something akin to a chair. Because if you ever drive, I went to a racetrack a couple of weeks ago, a place called Castle Combe with a bunch of veterans. And I didn't drive them because I can't drive on a racetrack, I'm not professional, but we had professionals beside us. And you can just feel your body being pressed back and side to side in these chairs, and you think, Christ, if I didn't have that chair with me, I'll be back over there somewhere, in several places. Now, chairs are pretty bloody useful when you're experiencing high speeds, because they keep you in your spot. So when you're in a little fire pilot ship, swinging all about the place when you've got a yerk on your tail or something like that, you'd think they'd have something to hold them in place, especially if just a quick change in speed blasts you into the back of the ship. Come on, Andalites, you're smarter than this. Invent something akin to a chair. Even if it's just a freaking strap around your upper body and it holds onto the... just something. My God. But anyway, they're also capable of going to zero space, because that quote there with the fighter going to zero space is Elfhanger on the Jahar looking out on these killer asteroids that, funnily enough, disappear in the next scene, mysteriously, about to swallow a bunch of Andalite fighters, and one of them gets prepared to zoom into zero space. So they are capable of zero space travel on their own. That does raise a question, because zero space travel in something that's meant to be transported via other craft seems a bit unnecessary, and in fact very dangerous. If you go into zero space and then something happens at the other end, how are you going to get anywhere? Let your transport ships way back somewhere else, but that's a story for a different day and much speculation. Let's now, you know, we've come out of the ship, we've been kicked out of the dome ship or the cruiser class, and we've flown around for a bit with our manoeuvring thrusters, and we've gone to maximum burn. We've even had a bit of zero space travel, but now we want to get back home, get back to our cruiser class, and just settle back down, or we want to settle down on somewhere like, I don't know, Earth. What's that process like? So I looked up, and there it was. A brilliant blue-white light that scooted across the sky, going fast at first, too fast for it to be an airplane, then slower and slower. What is it? The ship stopped and hovered almost directly over our heads, maybe 100 feet in the air. I could feel the hair on my head standing on end. It touched the ground, and instantly the blue lights went off. So when landing on a planet, or probably in a dome ship, it comes in and it's able to slow itself down, unlike something like an airplane which needs the friction of the ground to slow down. It's able to come down slow, and then it comes to a stop and hovers and then settles, and as soon as it hits the ground, the blue lights of the engines instantly off. It is funny that throughout the rest of the series, and even in the TV series, this part is depicted as a crash landing, whereas actually it seems very deliberate. He just brings them to a nice rest and then lowers it down. After that, they just have this weird is it the mandala effect? It's some sort of effect where they just build it into their own minds of, oh, it crash landed, bash, bang, wallop, you know. But no, he just settled it down nicely. So maybe that is a crash landing for an Andalite fighter. So, who is trained to do all these wacky things like getting kicked out of a dome ship, travelling through zero space and then landing calmly in construction sites? What type of Andalite is capable of that? Get to the dome, Aximili, Elfangor said. But I want to fight, I said. I can fly a fighter as well as... Do not argue with me, Aximili. Aurists do not go into battle. You are not a full warrior yet. Go to the dome. You will be safer there. I don't want to be safe, I said. But a warrior, even a warrior cadet, has to obey orders. Elfangor was my brother. He was also my prince. Quaffajinavon's red mouth pursed thoughtfully. Young human, that pilot is an Andalite warrior. One of the best trained fighters in the galaxy. I cannot hope to win a battle with him. Full Andalite warriors and some of the best in the galaxy. So they're pretty damn skilled fighters. And surely they must be. Because, you know, they weave in about, you know, all over the place. And they've got to fight space battles. So they are bound to be very, very good fighters. It's the same in like the Royal Navy or the Royal Air Force over here. You know, they don't hire any old Tom, Dick and Harry to fly these bloody things. You know, they've got to be well trained and they've got to be pretty damn good at it. And they've got to go through a lot of tests to make sure they're up to it. Because, you know, G-forces aren't a small thing. And that's who flies these things. Full Andalite warriors, the best of the best. So we've covered pretty much everything now of the Andalite fighters and what lovely little units they are. But let's now go over the miscellaneous functions, the one-off bits that we see throughout the series that don't really fit anywhere else in this video. Let's go through those now. I touched a screen with my fingers and the viewport became transparent. We could see directly out now, through an actual window, not just a screen. That's where this bit comes in, so that is actually a viewing screen, a visor at the front of this. And on this picture it's made to look almost like a motorcyclist's helmet. But it also acts as a screen, so it gets blocked off and it becomes a screen on the inside, but then you can open it up and actually see what is really the reality out there in front of you. So that's one of the functions. What about communications? There's a few instances of these being used to communicate or how they communicate. This is my Hirak Delest, my final statement. I've formed the mental link to the ThoughtSpeak transponder in my fighter's computer. I will record my memories before the Yeerks annihilate all trace of me. I stood before the communications panel. The Yeerks had altered some of the controls, but it was still basically a familiar Andalite panel. Computer, activate communications array, I ordered. Outgoing message. First address, Andalite homeworld. Priority 1, two-way communication demanded. Second address, Andalite space fleet. Priority 1, two-way communication demanded. The ship is able to record the Hirak Delest of Elfangor, which means that when he's outside the ship, or near enough outside the ship, he transfers his memories to be recorded inside the ship's computer to assumedly be sent back to the Andalite homeworld. Although, as I've discussed in a previous video, I forget which one. Yeah, I do forget which one. Oh no, it's the Elfangor's ship. In fact, that will be linked at the end of this video. Go watch that one if you want more details on this. Elfangor's ship, which itself was a fighter, a specific fighter. He recorded his Hirak Delest into the ship's computer, but then later on in the series we find out that, so far as we know, nobody knows about Elfangor dying. Certainly his own family didn't know, nor did the Andalites that Axe communicated with in that book. So we can assume that the ship can take on these messages, but it's not like an instant transmission thing. It got recorded and then the ship got blown up by Visser 3 and presumably that Hirak Delest was also destroyed. Okay, go watch the Elfangor's ship analysis after this one. It will pop up at the end and one of the, like, there or there or there or there. It will, trust me. Just get to like 15 seconds before the end of this video and you'll see it. It's also able to transmit messages and have live calls with other members of the Andalite fleet wherever they may be, which is, you know, pretty bog standard you'd imagine for a species this advanced, okay? So yeah, pretty bog standard. I pulled our fighter up alongside the damaged Skritnar ship and turned on the tractor beam to hold the two ships tightly together. I married my hatch to the Skritnar hatch and popped it open. I equalised gravities and marched as boldly as I could into the captured ship, with Arbron just behind me. There's a lot of implications that can be made from this quote. So he pulls his ship, something like this, alongside a Skritnar ship and marries the hatch to the Skritnars. So this circular bit on the side of the ship, maybe it protrudes a little bit from the sides of the ship, maybe not, but it's able to close itself, like seal itself to the Skritnar's hatch, which obviously being completely alien, surely the hatches don't match. Why would that be assumed? So maybe the Skritnar's hatch is rectangular like a human's would be. Yeah, it's hard to say unless there's some sort of mechanism on the outside of the ship that juts out, much like, you know, when you're coming onto an aircraft, like you're going to an airport and you travel through this tube, and eventually you get to the end of this tube and it's just the doorway to the airplane. You can't see like what's going on either side of it unless you like really look between the cracks. But it's just a tube that just sort of extends outwards a little bit at the end and marries to the aircraft hatch. Maybe it's something like that that comes out of this hatch and it just finds the edges of a doorway and jams itself to it. Very sci-fi, so I can accept that. If they just said, oh, sci-fi magic, it knows how to marry itself to an alien hatch. I'm satisfied with that. And that's probably how it goes. And then it equalised gravity. So the Skritnar ship probably had a slightly different gravity, and this ship is able to equalise that somehow. I don't know how. It manages to change the gravity of the other ship. Yeah, that bit's a bit weird. Maybe it's just more sci-fi jiggery pokery. But it does mean that these fighters have another purpose as well, and that is infiltrating alien vessels. So there's that. And the last one now, let's see what the last function is that we can glean about these Andalite fighters. Maybe Elfango had survived, somehow. But if he had, where was he? A fighter's sensors would have located me without great difficulty. Axe is in a dome ship under the sea. Far under the sea. But he says that Elfango's fighter should have been able to pick him up easily, implying that the sensors that these Andalite fighters have are capable of sensing stuff deep underwater. And from presumably far distances as well, because this all happened out in space. So maybe Elfango's ship would have ended up 1,000 miles away, theoretically. Not impossible. But Axe is like, yeah, his ship will easily find me. So it must have pretty strong sensors. Or it's specifically a homing sensor, because this is a dome ship that the fighter originated from. So maybe this fighter has an inbuilt homing device for its home vessel. That's also possible. That's all down to speculation, but that's the last we have of the Andalite fighter. And it's quite a nifty little machine, quite important. We'll circle back. This is the first thing that the Yeerks got their grubby little mitts on. And so all this technology that we've discussed today, it was now in Yeerk hands whenever they took that ship, which allowed them to travel the stars and get to where they needed to go. It all came from this and the Andalite transporters. So thank you, Andalite fighter. Actually, you know, a good addition to the series. Really quite important. So, what's next in what's next in the next episode? I was trying to think of another word for next. I hate using the same word twice in a sentence. What's next in the next episode? That doesn't even... Wife, stop screaming! My God, she's playing Chained Together. She's screaming her head off out there. Right, what's in the next AniLysis? We now have everything from books 1 up to and including 24, the Helmicron book, in here. So we have options such as Visser 3's Human Guards, Crocodile Morph, Tisha, all the way down to the Shrink Ray, the Helmicron Shrink Ray. So what's it gonna be in the next episode, whose number I forget? Spin diddly dee dee diddly dee dee doo 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 doo. What is it gonna be? Please be small. Poison Arrow Frog Morph. Okay, that will be quite small, because that's only in Alternamorphs 1, which I know is technically not released between books 1 and 24, but I read it in between collecting these, so I put them in. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that one is an Alternamorphs 1 exclusive. So the Poison Arrow Frog Morph will be the next AniLysis video. Bit of a departure from a lot of the sci-fi ones we've done lately, like ships and Andalite technology. So it's nice to get back down to earth for a morph. And we'll see you for that episode of AniLysis next time on Dragon Book, somewhere else in the Animorphs universe. Cheerio!